I want us to stop and think for a moment and think, what is your greatest fear? What causes the most fear in your life? Now, some may say, well, I'm not afraid of anything. But I don't believe that's quite true. I believe when everything is boiled down, the greatest fear in our life boils down to two things: the lack of knowledge and the lack of control. When we don't know what's going to happen, and when we can't control what's about to happen, it brings a sense of fear over us. Now, there's a lot of different fears. There's a fear of spiders. There's a fear of snakes. There's a fear of grasshoppers or even frogs, right? Because their movements are unknown. You go to try to grab a snake and they slither so fast, and there's a sense of fear with that. There's a fear of, am I able to pay the bills next month? Because it seems like it's out of control. And maybe a person that has a lot of money, when the stocks begin to crash, all of a sudden there's a sense of fear because of losing all of that money. And there's this sense of control. And even when we come down, and you might say, I don't have any types of fears. Now, how many of you, when you have no problem going through the lanes of the Welsh, like the Welsh lanes, and you have no problem driving through them at a good rate of speed, but you have a lot of fear and you are terrified sitting in the passenger seat, not naming the person who is in the driver's seat? Why is there a sense of fear? You don't have control. But the other thing is, you don't trust the person who is in control, right? When we read through these stories, there is a statement in each one of these, and really if we were to continue on in the next story, there's 3 stories lined up right in a row that Luke is really revealing things about Jesus, but it's also revealing things about us. And each one of the stories, whether it's the disciples and Jesus on the water, whether it's this demon man that comes out and Jesus casts the demon out, and then if you were to continue on to the next story, which is kind of two individuals and how their lives intersected and changed. The woman who had the issue of blood for 12 years and how she had been healed, and then Jairus, whose 12-year-old daughter is sick, is trying to get Jesus to come to his house, but then as he hears the news of the woman being healed, he gets the news that his daughter has just died. And in each one of these stories, it mentions about faith and fear. But what is interesting about each one of the stories is there is a fear, but then there's a greater fear after the miracle took place. Think about that. There is a fear, but all of a sudden, once Jesus acted, people were more afraid. And why is that? There are many things in life that bring fear. In fact, there's one element that is spoken about more often in the news, and it's AI. And there's a lot of great excitement around AI. The things and the capabilities that AI can do, artificial intelligence. But yet, people that know a little bit more about AI and the capabilities, there is a sense of fear. Because what if it's out of control? What if it begins controlling us rather than we controlling it? And the same thing when it comes down to our view of God. If Jesus is who he claims to be, does that bring a sense of peace to us? Or does it bring a sense of fear for us? As we look through this story, the very beginning, Luke chapter 8 and verse 22, it mentions how Jesus, early on in Luke chapter 8, Jesus had been teaching. He taught miracles in verse 22, it mentions that now it happened on a certain day that he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side of the lake." And they launch out. Just a normal day. They're all tired. They get into this boat. They're crossing over to the other side, but their night would change drastically. As they're crossing over, it says, and they launched out, but as they sailed, he fell asleep. He was tired. It was nighttime. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in jeopardy. The water, the waves were rising up, crashing over the boat. Now, growing up, I would see these pictures of kind of a large ship. The disciples are all in there. But a few years back, just before COVID, I had the chance to go over to Israel. And in Capernaum, there is, I think they call it Peter's boat. And you see this first century fishing boat that they've recovered. It's only about 8 feet wide, so from the back of this pulpit to the front of this pulpit, and about 27 feet long. So just less than a meter of the width of this building. That is the size of the boat that they would have been in. Probably the 13 of them in this boat. This windstorm comes up, and Sea of Galilee, it is the lowest freshwater lake in the world, about 210 meters below sea level. And with the mountains and the desert and all of the region around, the wind would come down, and that hot air and the cold air meeting there, storms would rise up in minutes. And this took place while they were on the Sea of Galilee. Now, for some people that have never been on the water, a little bit of ripples, and there's a fear. Have you ever been out on a small boat with somebody and just the little tiniest waves and they're grabbing and clinging for dear life? But at least half of these men were fishermen. Their fathers were fishermen. Probably from a young child they grew up out on the boat. They were familiar with this sea. They were familiar with the water. And yet in this instant, they were terrified. They didn't have control. But then they were a bit upset because Jesus, the one who they had been following, is sleeping. I mean, well, for one, how is he able to sleep in this? And then for two, how dare he sleep in this? And they cry out. It says, Master, Master, we are perishing. Now, if you look at Mark's account, there's a little bit more description, and Peter puts in like, this is actually what we said. Master, don't you care if we perish? Don't you care if we die? I mean, you're sleeping in the midst of this storm, and we're about to drown. We're in jeopardy. We're at the point of destruction, and you're just sleeping. And Jesus says, where is your faith? What are you trusting in? Are you trusting in your strength to get us across this water? Are you trusting in your strength to bail out the water faster than the water comes in? Are you trusting in me? And he says, or it goes on, then he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was a calm. And he says to them, where is your faith? Jesus rebukes the wind, rebukes the storm. Peace, be still, and everything was calm. And Jesus had asked that question, where is your faith? But notice the next verse. And they were afraid and marveled, saying to one another, who can this be? For he commands even the winds and water, and they obey him. Who can this be? But it mentions they were afraid. I believe Mark, it mentions it as a much stronger word. They were terrified. Yes, they were afraid of the storm, but all of a sudden, their level of fear rises because who is this who is in the boat, who is stronger and greater than the storm? We couldn't control the storm, but yet he can. But all of a sudden, when they get to the other side, there's another story that we find very similar to where people were afraid. They tried to control the matter. They were able to manage life. But all of a sudden, when Jesus dealt with it, there was a greater fear that overwhelmed people. In verse 26, it says, "Then they sailed to the country of the Gadarenes, which is opposite Galilee. And when he stepped out on the land, there met him a certain man from the city who had demons for a long time. And he wore no clothes, nor did he live in a house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out, fell down before him, and with a loud voice said, 'What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?'" And in one sense, as the disciples had been asking the question, who is this? These demons, when Jesus gets to the other side, he meets this man who is filled with demons. The demons knew exactly who Jesus was. They knew exactly the powers that he had. He is the Son of the Most High God. "I beg you," they say, "do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirits to come out of the man, for it had often seized him, and he was kept under guard, bound with chains and shackles. And he broke the bonds and was driven by the demon into the wilderness. Jesus asked him, saying, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," because many demons had entered him. And they begged him that he would not command them to go out into the abyss. When Jesus arrives to the other side, just after he had calmed the storm, they get to the other side and immediately they're met with this man. And can you imagine this man as he's coming and he's shouting and yelling and he's running towards them? He had been out in the wilderness, didn't have any clothes on. Mark describes how the man had been cutting himself. He wouldn't have had a clean haircut. His hair probably was a matted mess. His beard growing, cuts all over his body, no clothes, shouting and yelling and screaming. Think of the fear that the disciples would have had there. No longer living in the town. He might have even had chains still on him that he had broken. And Jesus casts the demon out. In fact, when he asks his name, the man didn't even give the name that his mother or father gave him. He just gives the name Legion, for we are many. He describes the amount of demons that possess him. Legion was really the regiment of maybe up to 6,000 Roman soldiers. It was basically a name for a large group of soldiers. And he casts this man out, or the demons out. It goes on, it says, "Now a herd of many swine was feeding there on the mountain." Mark describes that there was 2,000. So they begged him that he would permit them to enter them, and he permitted them. Then the demons went out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the lake and drowned. Demons didn't want to be cast into the abyss. They didn't want to be cast into hell. They wanted to still roam free. They still wanted to disrupt, but Jesus would not allow them to disrupt humanity any longer. He would not allow them to stay in this man, but yet they ask, okay, if we can't be in this man, can we go into the swine? Now, we don't understand why Jesus allows them, but he grants them their request. But here in this, it is just another reminder Jesus having the power over the devil and demons. And as Martin Luther put it, Satan is like a dog on the leash held by God's hand. He can only go as far as what God allows him to go. We see that in the life of Job. And Satan wanted to do certain things, and God allowed him, you can do this, but you can't do that. Okay, you can take a step further, but you can't take his life. And in this sense, Jesus casts them out. They request, okay, can we do this? And he grants that request. We may wonder why, but I wonder, maybe later on we see a bit more of the reason why he allowed it. Verse 34, it says, when those who fed them saw what had happened, they fled and told it in the city and in the country. Then they went out to see what had happened, and came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had departed, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Think of that. They were afraid because this man that they couldn't control, yet he went out into the wilderness, kind of, okay, we can manage life with him out there. We've tried to bind him, but he couldn't be bound. He just broke the chains. We tried to control him, but we couldn't control him. But he's left town, out of sight, out of mind. We can manage life without him. No, we can't cross through the countryside in that area because of the fear. We tell all of our children, stay away from there because it's dangerous. But we can manage life. But all of a sudden, here is somebody who can control what we have no power to control. Here's this man that no man could tame, and yet he's sane in his right mind. Here's a man who they could not bind with chains. They could not lock him down, but yet now he's actually wearing clothes. Here's a man that they could not restrain with force, and yet he's sitting willingly. What has happened? But what's interesting here is there is a fear when they see the man, but in just a moment we see they were seized with great fear. It goes on, it says, they also who had seen it told them by what means he had been demon-possessed was healed. Then the whole multitude of the surrounding region of the Gadarenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. And he got into the boat and returned. The word seized really means to be controlled. And what's interesting is in verse 29, it mentions that for it often had seized him. The demon-possessed man had often been seized by the demons. Jesus had cast the demons out, and all of a sudden these other individuals, seeing what had taken place and by what means it had taken place, they had become seized with fear, overwhelmed by fear, which means they were controlled by their fears. There's those levels of fears. Okay, I'm afraid, but it's not going to control my decisions and my actions. But then there are those levels of fear that it controls us. And that is the level of fear that it had risen to. But the question is, why? In a sense, it goes back almost, the disciples were more afraid, recognizing who Jesus was sitting in their boat, allowing the storm to come up, and yet he had control to stop the storm. Now we have Jesus displaying he has the power not over the natural sources, but also over the supernatural. But also, I think there's an element also about the cost of a transformed life. Think of that. What did it cost them for this life to be transformed? A herd of swine. Now, if we were to be asked, what's more valuable? An individual's life being radically transformed or a herd of swine? I think all of us would say the individual's life transformed. But what if that cost became personal? What if it was your herd of swine? If somebody else is paying the bill, we will choose the individual. But if it's my herd of swine that's lost, I don't even know that person. He's out of sight. He's out of mind. It doesn't matter to me. What I care about is what I do know, and that's my herd of swine. That's my livelihood. That's my possessions. Not only that, if Jesus sticks around and he disrupts our economy like this for the sake of this man's life, what else could he do? What else could he ask me to do? And really it comes down to, how much am I willing to follow? Because if I follow, that means he is leading. How much am I willing to surrender to allow him to lead? How much do I trust him to take control of my life, every area of my life? How much of my life do I try to manage and take control, whether it's out on the boat, and this is something that I'm very confident and very capable of doing, and I can do life without God. But all of a sudden, when things rise up to a level to where I can't control, and God does have that power, and he reveals that he has more power than what we have, and he reveals that we are not in control of life as much as we think we are. How much do we trust him enough to surrender to him? To allow him? We don't know the stakes that it might cost us. And for them, it cost them a herd of swine. And when they heard by what means this life was transformed, they were seized with great fear. Their fear was so strong that it caused them, or began to control their actions. And it says, and he got into the boat and returned. They said, Jesus, we don't want you around here. Yes, I know you healed the man, but we're afraid of what else you might do. In verse 38, it says, now the man from whom the demons had departed begged him, begging Jesus that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, return to your own house and tell what great things God has done for you. The man whose life had been changed desired and longed to be with Jesus. Hey, Jesus, okay, I know that the people don't want you. And I know you're leaving and you're getting back on the boat. You just got out of the boat. You didn't go any further. I'm the only person that you changed, and I want to be with you. Please, please, can I go with you? Maybe it was a thought, you know what? They don't like you, and they're sending you away. And because you changed my life, maybe they won't like me. Because it was my life, my transformed life, that caused the disruption. Please, can I just leave? You are my safe space. You are the one that I can find that refuge. But Jesus says, no. I have a greater job and a greater task for you, to stay. And in one sense, you could say, this man was allowed to go places where Jesus was not allowed. Jesus granted the requests of the people. But he told the man, no, I want you to return to your house and tell what great things God has done for you. And it says, and he went his way and proclaimed throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. In one sense, I stop and think about Jesus. Yes, he was crucified. He died on the cross. He rose again the third day to give us that victory and that hope, the forgiveness of our sins. Our lives have been transformed when we put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ. But remember, 40 days later, he ascended back up into heaven. And he gave us the command, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. In one sense, Jesus in the bodily form was no longer going to be on this earth. But what is called the body of Christ today? The church. And as Jesus here left the region, he left this man behind, the transformed life, to continue to speak about all that God had done for him. Later on, when you look at the passages, when Jesus goes back to Decapolis, you find the feeding of the 4,000 that were all gathered together, wanting to hear from Jesus. What was the difference? Well, what we know of is this man who stayed in Decapolis, telling others about the transformation that was in his life. If you continued on in the passage about the woman who had had the issue of blood for 12 years, and she sneaks through the crowd to touch the hem of Jesus' garments, wants to sneak in, wants to sneak out. But Jesus stops, knows what had taken place, and he asks, who touched me? And when the woman knew, in verse 47 it says, now when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him. She declared to him in the presence of the people the reason she had touched him and how she was made healed. She, after she had been healed, she comes to Jesus when she knows she can't hide any longer. She comes trembling. Once again, fear after the miracle. But Jesus speaks to her and says, daughter, be of good cheer. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be of good cheer. There is no reason to fear any longer. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. But then at the same moment, Jairus gets the news, your daughter is dead. And Jesus speaks in verse 50, but when Jesus heard it, he answered him saying, do not be afraid. Only believe, and she will be made well. In every single one of these stories, there is fear, but also trust. Fear. But each one of them, there's a greater fear after the miracle. And really it comes down for each one of us. At what level of trust do we have in Jesus? Are you willing to trust him as God? As Lord over all? Are you willing to trust him for salvation? Many people would say, you know what? I'm willing to trust him for the forgiveness of my sins, but I'm not willing to trust him with my daily life. I'm glad that he forgives me of my sins, but I still want to remain in control of my daily life. And I still want to do as I please, not surrender to him. And when the thought about God being Lord and Master, that actually creates a fear for some, because it's letting go of control. But really it goes back to trusting him as the loving, caring God. Do we trust him that he loves and cares for us more than we love and care for ourselves? And that's where Jesus could speak to this woman, daughter, be of good cheer. You don't have to be afraid. Your faith has made you whole. And when we come to God, yes, He's the all-powerful God. But when we come through Jesus Christ, putting our faith and trust in Him, He welcomes us in as His dear children. Not for us to be afraid, but to have good cheer, to have that peace that passes all understanding. So really the question, how do we view Him? And are we willing to surrender to Him? And as Jesus has ascended back into heaven, are we continuing to tell others what great things God has done in our lives and how He has transformed our lives through Jesus Christ? My chains are gone. I've been set free through Jesus Christ.